And the speaker this evening is Grace McNutt. And Grace hails from Sydney. And in 2014, she began her post-secondary studies at Cape Breton University. She was a Chancellor Scholarship recipient then. She graduated in 2018 with her Bachelor of Arts, Honors in History, and she was awarded the Silver Medal for the highest aggregate in a BA program, and the Angus Gus Morrison Scholarship for Excellence in History. She began her master's studies at St. Mary's here in Halifax in the fall of 2018. 2019, she received a Shirk Canadian Graduate Scholarship to complete her thesis. And she defended that thesis in June of 2020 and graduated with her Master of Arts in Atlantic Canada Studies, and she was valedictorian. Now, the subject of her thesis is her subject for this evening. And before I move to that, I just wanted to mention also that Grace is co-host and resident historian on the Minute Women. Now, that's a podcast. Some of you may not know about it at all. I learned about it several months ago. There have been 55 episodes to date. It's bi-weekly, and Grace and her co-host present Canadian history subjects like Sir John A. Macdonald, Niagara Falls, I think things we didn't know about the falls, Joe Howe and responsible government, various items like that. And as I say, there's 55 episodes so far. They're lighthearted with a modern twist. In other words, not your usual history class. So I think this is an unusual departure. It's very timely, and we're interested this evening in some of the very serious work that Grace has been doing. Her thesis, Oppression in the Shadows, the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia and the Department of Indian Affairs, 1760 to 1950. It's a comprehensive political history. It traces the history of Nova Scotia's Department of Indian Affairs from its earliest colonial origins to the centralization policies of the 1940s. And one of the findings that Grace will be drawing out is the importance of region to the experience of the Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia. It's a large topic. Grace, over to you and welcome.
Hi, Lois, and hello to everyone. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Like Lois said, my name is Grace McNutt. I'm a graduate of Cape Breton University and St. Mary's University, and now I am attending as a PhD candidate at Dalhousie University starting in the fall of 2021. As Lois said, the title of my presentation is Oppression in the Shadows, the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia and the Development of Indian Affairs, 1760 to 1950. So you can tell that there's quite a breadth of time that my thesis covers. So it's probably best to just jump right into the presentation. So I'm just going to share my screen quickly and bring up my PowerPoint. Hopefully everyone can see that. So in the broadest of terms, my thesis and the research I'll be presenting today is a political history of the development of Indian affairs in Nova Scotia. And something I really tried to emphasize throughout the writing of this research and also in the presentation today is that this is definitely a political history and not necessarily a piece of Indigenous history. It more is suited as a piece of political history that deals with an Indigenous topic. And that's because Indigenous history at this point is a well-defined, well-written field within history. And this work doesn't meet many of the criteria required to be categorized as such. I am not an Indigenous person, therefore it's not written or researched by an Indigenous author. I didn't use Indigenous methodologies or prioritize Indigenous sources in the research of this piece. All things that are necessary to view something as a piece of Indigenous history. That being said, there's still space within our historiography for more Western, quote unquote, methodologies and fields to look at Indigenous history. And I believe it's of utmost importance that we try and use Indigenous history within our more generalized field of history. And it's by doing that, we find these really interesting overlaps in our analyses, like the issues of race and labor, environment and interests, domination and resistance. And so this study seeks to reincorporate the history of the Mi'kmaq into our broader provincial political history, as well as analyze the evolving politics, policies, and procedures of the Department of Indian Affairs as a reflection of the changing stages of colonization in Canada. So more specifically, my thesis set out to challenge the precedent set by our current national historiographical paradigm that explains the development of the Department of Indian Affairs as a tool for the colonial regime to assimilate Indigenous peoples. So when I was beginning my research and looking at trying to understand how the Department of Indian Affairs affected the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia, what I was finding was that the vast majority of our historical literature was describing a Department of Indian Affairs, or a DIA, that I just didn't see in the Nova Scotia context very much. So this Department of Indian Affairs is typically categorized and described as being very pervasive, very hard-nosed, almost militant in their invasion of Indigenous communities. And while that is certainly the case for some peoples, I wasn't seeing that in Nova Scotia. And it's not to say that there wasn't changes in this historical interpretation over time. Certainly the interpretation of the morality of that power, so the power that the DIA had, changed over time, from early colonial histories that viewed the DIA as ultimately being good and benevolent, to more modern histories that have deep-seated criticisms of the Department of Indian Affairs, its policies and procedures. However, what I was finding was that this kind of Department of Indian Affairs, the existence of that power, didn't really show up in the Nova Scotia context very much. And I realized that I had kind of three major criticisms of this interpretation when looking at the Nova Scotia context. So first of all, I was finding a Department of Indian Affairs that had a lot of fluctuating policies. For assimilation to really be the core policy of the DIA, you would expect to see some sort of consistency. You know, there might be some changes in policy, but assimilation is always being pursued to some extent. But what I was finding was assimilation in the Nova Scotia context, so policies like residential schools, for example, weren't typically the norm. They tended to be the exception to the rule in the Nova Scotia context. So that was the first example of something that really conflicted with the image of the DIA I was finding in the current national history. The second was regional differences. What I was finding was that while the interpretation being presented by a lot of historians was accurate to certain regions, I was finding that it really wasn't accurate when specifically looking in Nova Scotia and the Maritime provinces as a whole. And this really challenges the notion that assimilation is the core policy, because you would expect to see all forms of indigeneity treated as equally deviant or equally amoral in the eyes of assimilation. The indigeneity, why is the indigeneity of the Mi'kmaq being treated so differently? And then the final example that I found was lax observation. So for assimilation to really take hold, you do need a body that is kind of like Big Brother, that's always going to be there and always punishing individuals for not following the new norms or the new normals that are being established by the colonial government. But what I found in Nova Scotia was a DIA that was actually pretty lazy, especially in their observation and reporting on the Mi'kmaq. So for example, the quote that I have here on the slide is taken from the annual report of the Department of Indian Affairs in 1925. It's part of a longer quote that actually describes every province in Canada, and it talks about the various successes of the Department of Indian Affairs in those regions when it comes to occupations. But this quote doesn't just appear in the 1925 report, it appears in every single report for 12 subsequent years. It's copied and pasted year after year after year. And this is during some of the harshest economic climates that this country has had to go through. So it's just one example of a Department of Indian Affairs that's really not paying any attention at all, both in the actual reporting, but then in the fact that nobody's even noticing that this section is being reported, or at least they just don't care enough to go in and change it. This is also the only qualitative reporting that's done in the entire annual reports by this point. Everything else is just numeric reporting. So what I determined was that this theory that assimilation was the core policy of the Department of Indian Affairs rose to prominence partly due to the fact that the vast majority of our histories on experiences of Indigenous people, especially experiences of oppression, examine very specific Indigenous groups in this country. Largely, they are peoples that are located in Southern Ontario and in Western Canada. However, I found by examining a more underrepresented region like Nova Scotia, the shortcomings of this theory become clearer and clearer. And so my thesis proposed an alternative theory where assimilation was just part of the collection of philosophies, procedures, and policies that the DIA promoted. Throughout my research, I referred to this kind of collection of philosophies, procedures, and policies as a colonial agenda, which was really a catch-all term for anything that the DIA was pursuing to achieve the ultimate goal of colonialism, which is to extract resources and wealth from another country and from another people. So what I ultimately propose is that the DIA and its various institutional predecessors and successors was run more specifically with the intention of protecting capital investments. As the governments and their economic interests change over time, so do the policies that were being promoted by the Department of Indian Affairs. So in some regions, at certain times, assimilation is the best policy for the Department of Indian Affairs to pursue to ultimately extract wealth and resources from Indigenous peoples. But in other regions and during different periods of time, as we will see as we go throughout the body of this research, assimilation is not in the best financial interest for the Department of Indian Affairs. So getting into kind of the main body of the research, my thesis and this subsequent research is broken down into 4 chapters that are ordered chronologically. And they walk you through distinct political and economic periods in Nova Scotia's history as it relates to the Mi'kmaq people and their interactions with the Department of Indian Affairs. I do use Department of Indian Affairs quite regularly throughout this talk, just for simplicity's sake. But it is important to note that the Department of Indian Affairs specifically doesn't really come to be until after Confederation. In Nova Scotia, there were varying offices and departments that fulfilled those duties. And then following the late 1930s, the Department of Indian Affairs is consumed by the Department of Mines and Resources and just becomes the Indian Affairs branch. But I use DIA as kind of a catch-all term for those institutions. So the first chapter goes through the British imperial government and early Indian affairs in Nova Scotia. The second chapter is the period of responsible government in Nova Scotia and the establishment of the Office of Commissioner of Indian Affairs. The third chapter deals with Confederation, the creation and debates around the Indian Act, and then Mi'kmaq eligibility. And then the final chapter deals with the post-First World War period, the end of Mi'kmaq eligibility, and centralization. So getting into the first chapter, British imperial government and early Indian affairs in Nova Scotia. So this period deals with the years from 1760 to roughly 1830. And during this period of time, the Nova Scotian government is characterized and typified by a very small government that is trying to consolidate power in a newly won region of the British Empire. So during this period of time, the British are trying to consolidate their power, and the Mi'kmaq are seen as somewhat of a threat to this power. The level of that threat changes over time, though, and that is ultimately what is going to determine how the British government in Nova Scotia treats Mi'kmaq people in the political sphere. So there's two principal factors that determine the way in which the Mi'kmaq are treated. The first is war, so colonial wars that the British government was engaging in. British power in the region was fairly new at this period of time, and it certainly wasn't a given. There were other colonial powers in the region. There was this constant fear of American power. There was also fear of French power returning to the region. And so the British feared that the Mi'kmaq would revive their historic alliance with the French, or they would seek out other colonial alliances should the British government not placate the Mi'kmaq people during this period of time. So what we end up seeing is this pattern where during times of war, the colonial government of Nova Scotia would seek to placate the Mi'kmaq. They would do this with gifts, money, coats, whatever it is that they needed or what they were asking for, in hopes that the Mi'kmaq would not seek out other alliances. They would just be calm enough that during periods of war, they were just kind of a non-factor. However, during times of peace, a lot of those programs that were set up to give gifts, so gift-giving ceremonies, for instance, would end and would be revoked from the Mi'kmaq, because during this period of time, the Mi'kmaq couldn't leverage the fear of a colonial alliance to gain or take anything from the British government. And this is best symbolized by the fact that the Office of Superintendent General of Indian Affairs would regularly lapse during peace times. So it was almost part of the War Office, the Department of War, would be the Superintendent General. George Monk was the first, and he on and off fills that role for about 30 years. And during times of peace, he would often be let go. The other factor that really drove and established the way in which the Mi'kmaq were being treated was settlement. So the Nova Scotia government was highly incentivized to clear as much land as possible to make way for desirable European settlers to ensure the establishment of an agrarian capitalist society. So they're consolidating their power and wealth through settlement. And the Mi'kmaq really didn't have a place in this worldview whatsoever, despite treaties that assured them access to certain resources and lands. And so they're quickly moved out of the way. However, and while that is not unique to Nova Scotia, it happens at a very fast rate in Nova Scotia due to the geography. We have so much coastline in Nova Scotia and such small interior relative to that, that land gets eaten up very quickly. And so the Mi'kmaq are very quickly having to just live with European neighbors, whereas in some other regions of the country, there is this idea of a frontier that Indigenous people could escape to. All of this is to say that we don't really see the establishment of any kind of assimilation policy in Nova Scotia during this period of time. It's not in the best financial interest for the British government to do so. Then we move into the second chapter, the period of responsible government in Nova Scotia. So now we no longer are dealing with a larger, wealthier British government managing Indigenous affairs in the country, but rather a very small personal government in Nova Scotia that has access to far fewer resources than the British imperial government did. During this period of time, the Office of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs was created. However, this office doesn't actually have a specific mandate. The only measure of success that they had was just keeping costs as low as possible. As I mentioned earlier, it's a very small government, far fewer resources than they had previous to responsible government. So the idea is to just make sure that this office doesn't spend a whole lot of money on undesirable, quote unquote, people in Nova Scotia. So as a result, the office is highly susceptible to whatever the personal views and values and philosophies of whoever the commissioner was, who really has sole power for the most part over Indian affairs in Nova Scotia. And these philosophies can be dramatically different depending on who is in office. So for instance, we have Joseph Howe, Abraham Gesner, and William Chernley. They are just 3 of the commissioners that filled this office during this period of time. Joseph Howe, for instance, a very traditional assimilation kind of person. He thinks that the best thing for the Mi'kmaq would be to attend schools where they can learn English and learn about Western culture. The Nova Scotian government should do their best to supply Mi'kmaq people with instruments to farm and seed to grow. However, that is ultimately very expensive in the eyes of the Nova Scotian government, and it doesn't really follow through. But you can see represented in Joseph Howe a very traditional assimilation policy that gets implemented across the country. Abraham Gesner, on the other hand, a very religious person, and he enters the office with this notion that the Mi'kmaq people have a certain divine right to the lands in Nova Scotia, and therefore the Nova Scotian government should be recognizing the treaties that they signed with the Mi'kmaq far more than they were. This isn't to say that he was a huge person who viewed like the Mi'kmaq as equal to Europeans. He ultimately believed that the best life for the Mi'kmaq would be one reflecting Europeans, but he does believe that a lot more money and effort should be put towards protecting their resources and lands. And then finally, you have William Chernley, who believes that the Mi'kmaq are intellectually incapable of assimilating, and so the only responsibility of the department or the Office of Commissioner of Indian Affairs is to just ease the pain of their dying days. Eventually, the race will die out, and so they should just give them as much coat and money and food as they need to survive. So you can see that there's this huge swath of different philosophies that's being represented during this period of time. And to make it even more susceptible to change, the commissioner was unpaid, which resulted in a high rate of turnover during this period of time. There's also like no prestige associated with the office. So you see people coming and going very quickly, and therefore the government is so inaccessible to the Mi'kmaq because there's no time to adjust to new policies and new procedures. There's no consistency from commissioner to commissioner. So in the 3rd chapter, we get into the era of the Department of Indian Affairs, Confederation, the Indian Act. So no longer is Indian affairs being managed specifically in Nova Scotia. It's now regulated by a federal body out of Ottawa. And the first thing to note during the creation of the Indian Act, so this act that is ultimately going to go on and regulate and control Mi'kmaq and Indigenous lives, there is virtually no maritime representation during the writing of the Indian Act. So the debates surrounding the Indian Act during that period of time, during those debates, one MP from New Brunswick discusses the situation that takes place in New Brunswick, and that is the only time a maritime province or a maritime Indigenous people are discussed. Instead, the federal government is far more concerned with 2 specific populations of Indigenous peoples. So first are Indigenous peoples living in Western Canada. They're represented by the Minister of the Interior, David Laird, and the former head of the DIA, Hector Louis Lavagin. They characterize the Indigenous people as being violent, uncivilized, childlike, and mind you, this is during and in the wake of the rebellions in Manitoba. So that's their experience with Indigenous communities, and therefore they feel very threatened by these people, and so they do not deserve rights of citizenship, they do not deserve autonomy, they should be treated like wards of the state. On the other side of the debate, you have members of Parliament, William Patterson of South Brant and John Fleming of Waterloo, both in Ontario, of course, and they characterize Indigenous people as being very calm, very civilized, quote unquote, very knowledgeable of Western culture, economies, politics. And so they believe that the Indian Act should be designed to cater towards people like this, to establish programs that would gradually assimilate and grant them citizenship while ultimately revoking their Indian status and their claim to indigeneity along the way. So despite these groups being characterized as very different, there's some really important similarities between groups in Western Canada and Southern Ontario. They are some of the most populous Indigenous groups in the country during this period of time. They are also the wealthiest Indigenous groups during this period of time. So they have population and they have money relatively. And most importantly, they live near centers of economic and political power. So these Indigenous people, just by their proximity to these areas, represent a threat to the newly established government of Canada. The Mi'kmaq, on the other hand, have none of these things. They are an incredibly small Indigenous group during this period of time. They are the poorest Indigenous group in the country, and they live in a political and economic periphery, which highlights the significant role that region plays in defining the Indigenous experience in Canada. And it kind of creates this double periphery for the Mi'kmaq. So they live in this state of periphery racially, where they are viewed as a minority. But in addition to that, they live in a minority region of the country that is really not thought of as frequently as other more centralized regions of Canada. So ultimately, this leads to the Indian Act being produced without any knowledge of the Mi'kmaq and their experience and their circumstances. But at the same time, they're expected to meet the same standards of larger, wealthier, and more powerful Indigenous groups without any kind of specialized support to do so. No special allocation of resources in any way. And this creates a state of illegibility. So the lack of representation resulted in the Mi'kmaq existing in a state of illegibility under the Indian Act. There was legislation to observe and assimilate the Mi'kmaq, which on paper was implemented. However, in reality, those institutions of surveillance were very hollow. So while on the surface level, it seems like the Mi'kmaq are being treated the same or would be living under similar assimilation policies as the rest of the country, in reality, the DIA was not pursuing assimilation in the same way in Nova Scotia as it was in areas of Western Canada and Southern Ontario. I'll also note that I'm not the first person to come up with this concept. There are other historians who do this, though they typically use the term invisibility. Though during the writing of this thesis, myself and my supervisor, we determined that the term illegibility fits a lot more of what we were seeing, in the sense that there's nothing inherent to the Mi'kmaq that makes them unseeable to the federal government. Instead, you have a federal government that is choosing not to learn how to read the Mi'kmaq people. And then finally, we get to the last chapter, which deals with the post-First World War period, the end of Mi'kmaq eligibility and centralization in Nova Scotia. So why does this state of illegibility end for the Mi'kmaq people? Why does the DIA start playing an increased role in the lives of the Mi'kmaq? This can partly be explained by the emergence of Duncan Campbell Scott. He's largely known as the architect of assimilation policies, the architect of residential schools, for instance. And this is partly the case, but it should also be understood as a really important economic shift that's taking place in Nova Scotia following the First World War, which is a shift from a predominantly rural agrarian economy to an industrial urban economy. So previously, where you would see the Mi'kmaq in terms of legibility, they would show up in court documents. That's where you would see the Mi'kmaq, quote unquote. And previous to this period, the vast majority of court cases the Mi'kmaq are dealing with are with poor rural farmers. That is where the most valuable land is in Nova Scotia during this period of time, is in rural communities. So you have small, kind of insignificant clashes taking place between the Mi'kmaq and these poor rural farmers, which kind of creates this punching across instance or battle. The Indian agents could pretty effectively represent and defend the Mi'kmaq from these encroachments, and they just really weren't that significant. They're not going to go to the federal DIA in a lot of cases. However, following the First World War, these legal battles become more publicized and seen because the Mi'kmaq were now not fighting for rural farmers, they're fighting against middle and upper class industrialists who have increased financial and legal resources to beat them in court. So no longer are the most valuable lands in Nova Scotia the ones in the countryside. Now they're ones in the urban centers. And so during the First World War and following the First World War, you see really important court cases taking place that result in the Mi'kmaq being removed from urban reserves or urban lands. So Tufts Cove, for instance, is a really important example. Kings Road Reserve in Sydney is another really important example of this. So you start to see an increased presence of the Department of Indian Affairs during that period of time because of this. But it's also explained by various economic crises that are taking place in Nova Scotia and Canada more widely. This is a period of economic boom and bust in Canada. For Nova Scotia, it's mostly a period of economic bust. So you see the Nova Scotian government constantly asking the provincial branch of the DIA or the federal DIA to cut costs for the Department of Indian Affairs. So they want to cut back on resources and implement policies of assimilation that are viewed to be cheaper for them to finance. The Canadian government, on the other hand, they really only feel these economic crunches during the Great Depression and the onset of the Second World War. So Great Depression, obviously a lot less money floating around, and onset of the Second World War, the federal government has now has to fund the war effort overseas. So it's really only when the federal government or when both governments feel this economic pressure do they implement major assimilation reforms to the policies and procedures being pursued in Nova Scotia by the Department of Indian Affairs. So these two policies are rationalization and centralization. Rationalization cuts costs because it reduces the number of Indian agents working in Nova Scotia. So instead of 22 part-time workers, which was very abnormal, Nova Scotia was the only province that had part-time Indian agents. Instead, they're going to reduce that down to just 3 full-time employees, 3 full-time Indian agents in Nova Scotia. So that's switching from part-time local agents to full-time centralized agents. So you no longer would have an agent right in your community or at least nearby. And this was implemented during the 1930s, but it was quickly redacted following criticism that the federal government was cutting jobs during the Depression. Centralization was implemented at the onset of the Second World War, and it cuts costs by reducing the number of reserves in Nova Scotia from to just down to 2. So it would be Shubenacadie and the Eskasoni Reserve. So the policy was to essentially have all status Indians removed from their reserves and relocated to these more centralized ones where they would build on-reserve services. And so over time, you're cutting a lot of costs. This was implemented, but it was very poorly implemented. And this was largely due to the fact that they didn't really do a study for how it would effectively take place in Nova Scotia. The person who drew up the report quite literally says in the report, this worked in Ontario, so it should probably work here. And that's not really going into any of the nuances of the Mi'kmaq experience. It was ultimately redacted in the 1950s. And it's generally considered a failure because it was extremely expensive and it really didn't cut any costs. And a lot of Mi'kmaq people were not ultimately taken off of their reserves. That being said, there were many Mi'kmaq who were uprooted from their communities and were unable to ever return home. So it's certainly not a failure in that sense. So by analyzing this kind of narrative, this political history of how the Department of Indian Affairs operated in Nova Scotia from 1760 to 1950, I took away three main conclusions. So the first of those is that neglect and mismanagement by the Department of Indian Affairs far better characterize the kinds of oppression that the Mi'kmaq experienced rather than forced assimilation programs. And it's important for us as historians now to appreciate and discuss neglect and mismanagement as a means of oppression, not a means through which Indigenous people could resist oppression. There's quite a large body of literature that when we position assimilation as the core policy of the Department of Indian Affairs, if the Department of Indian Affairs is neglecting that particular population, they're not there constantly observing the Mi'kmaq, for instance, the interpretation comes to be that those people managed to circumvent the system, that they were able to avoid oppression because they were being neglected and they weren't looked at. And it's not to say that that is wholly wrong in every circumstance, but when we create that narrative, it can be really damaging when trying to analyze how oppression takes place in certain regions of the country, because the narrative then becomes the Mi'kmaq were less oppressed than other Indigenous groups in the country, and that's certainly not the case. Secondly, positioning assimilation as just part of the DIA's scheme to subjugate Indigenous peoples allows for a wider range of Indigenous experiences to be examined and understood as direct oppression as a consequence of colonialism. So in this era of truth and reconciliation, it's very important that we approach those conversations with a very holistic, open-minded view of what oppression was for Indigenous peoples to ensure that all voices are being heard in those discussions. And then finally, region is a massive factor when considering the variety of Indigenous experiences in Canada. It can't be acceptable moving forward to consider the experiences of one region's Indigenous experience of oppression as the national story. The idea of a national history of colonialism needs to have space and room, an allocation for discussion of regionality, so a better understanding of Indigenous oppression can be analyzed and discussed. Because the experience of the Mi'kmaq was certainly an experience of oppression. It just didn't look like the experience of oppression that we see in a lot of historical literature. And that is my presentation. So I'll stop sharing my screen. There we go.
Hello, Shirley Tillotson here, trying to start my video. Here I am. Well, thank you, Grace, for that analytically sharp and speedy survey through a big variety of a big period of time. We have in the comments section already virtual applause and enthusiastic praise. Now, so I want to invite comments and questions, and we have a couple of ways to do this. Sarah Hollett, I see, has already taken one, which is the, oh no, that was an applause, not a question, hand raising. You will see, members of the audience, if you move your cursor, your mouse, whatever, over your screen at the bottom, you will see a reactions link. And for various reasons, it doesn't include putting up your hand, but I see Sarah Hollett has found a way to put up her hand. So you can either put up your hand or use one of the reaction items to get my attention. And I will also look for people who have unmuted their microphone and put you in the line. I won't ask you to I'll ask you not to speak until I call on you. But if you unmute yourself, I will see that you are wishing to raise a question. So I hope that helps you to know how you will ask a question. I'll remind you that this is being recorded. So please do think of that when you pose your questions or make your comments. And I will also add that if neither the icon or the taking yourself off mute works, you can also address a question to me in the chat part. So one way or the other, we will manage to get questions for Grace McNutt. Now, Sarah Hollett has taken down her hand. Does that mean, Sarah, that you don't have a question? Or Sarah, would you like to ask?
I have a question. I was just demonstrating. It's actually under the reactions. There's a little button that says raise hand, and it'll stay on until you're ready to lower it. And you go back, and then you can take it away by clicking lower hand.
You say that this is so, alas, it is not so on my interface,
Really?
Sarah. So what can I say? It may not be there for everyone.
Okay.
But look in your reactions. If you see a raise hand option, folks, I will notice that in the gallery and call on you. So, Sarah Hollett, you have a question or comment?
I don't have a question yet.
You do not.
I was
Okay.
demonstrating. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Okay.
I see Anne-Marie has unmuted herself, and that probably means that she does have a question or comment.
Hi, Shirley. Hi, Grace. Thank you so much for that fascinating talk. Gosh, that represents an enormous amount of analysis. I'm really impressed. I'm right now working on the late 18th and very early 19th century. And one thought that crossed my mind is that I know when we're looking at, particularly at the 19th century and policy in the time and you know, wanting to be more like Ontario, I won't say that, but that's sort of the obsession with agrarian development and farmland, et cetera, when really a vast amount of, well, a vast percentage, shall we say, of the wealth created is from coasts and coastal access. And I noticed that the early 19th century, there does seem to be a tendency to create reserves quite far from the coasts. And I was wondering if you had looked at that as being something systematic as part of this policy, or you know, if that's something you were planning to look at. But I just had to throw in coastline, as I'm very fond of it. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly where reserves were set up was part of the scheme to both oppress, but especially neglect. You don't want them to be on top of successful white settlements that are taking place. You want them to be far removed from lands that would be desirable for settlement, and also very populous white settlements in the British period, at least, which is a little past the late 18th century, or I guess it would be late 18th century, sorry. And that certainly extends and gets worse as time goes on. So a major scheme that the British government would, and the Nova Scotian government would implement to raise funds for the Mi'kmaq would not be to include their budget in taxation, for example, but would be to say, we need more money, we need more bullion to help the Mi'kmaq, so we'll sell off this reserve to white people. We'll use that fund and it will go into an Indian fund. So over time, a lot of the really valuable land winds up getting sold off. And so by really the 20th century, you know, the vast majority of them are infertile lands that could never be cultivated, even if you wanted to, which is a huge hurdle that the Mi'kmaq face after the creation of the Indian Act, and such strong pursuit for agriculture is really implemented in Nova Scotia. There's one Indian agent that comes to mind out of Canning who just refers to the reserve as the gravel pit, because that's all there is for the people to harvest there.
Wow, impressive. And I was the coastal access is rather top of mind these days too. So
Yeah.
But you know, it really, really interesting. Thanks so much for that, Grace.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments? I, of course, have 12, and we'll go now. Yes, okay, I'll go now. And possibly again if I have another chance. Okay, so Grace, I like very much the underpinning argument for adding a third region, if you like, and yet I am noticing that you're very careful to say Southern Ontario when you speak of the regional comparator. So, and I guess I wonder if you could talk about any differentiation between region and province and between North and South in relationship to this concept of region that you're using.
Yeah, so the term Southern Ontario really came from the debates. So the members of parliament who were really active in the debates for the Indian Act come very specifically from Southern Ontario, mostly due to the fact that it's in the political and economic hub of the country during that period of time. I think you could also really argue effectively that you could refer to that as the kind of the Laurentian area, the St. Lawrence River Valley of Ontario and Quebec. The term Southern Ontario really specifically just came from those debates. In terms of difference between Northern Ontario and Southern Ontario, that I would have to do a little bit more research on, but my educated guess is really that for Nova Scotia, the reason that I look at it is because it is a peripheral region. So kind of the idea that if you look at peripheries, you might find a lot of similarities in their experiences. So I would most likely expect to see something more along the lines of what you see in Nova Scotia taking place in Northern Ontario. If not that, I would probably expect to see something similar to that of Western Canada, just given their geographical proximity to each other. But that's more of an educated guess than an actual researched answer.
Yeah. No, I mean, the complaint of the Maritimes and the Maritime Rights Movement is the provinces is that we have no north. Yeah. We have no vast frontier of land, whether for forestry or mining or whatever, right? And I guess probably that's the thing that differentiates the maritime problem from the northern problem, because the northern, I think it's a different kind of region. In other words, I think they're really probably, in terms of the analysis that you want to do, maybe 4 significant regions to think of. Anyhow, so that's great. And I see John Reed has his hand up, so we'll call on him and see what he has to say. John.
Great, thank you very much. Grace, really enjoyed your presentation, just as I enjoyed the thesis that came before it. And I'm just going to throw in an argument that's certainly not original to me with respect to the period, particularly from 1815 to maybe about 1850, the era of this massive colonial settlement. That Stephen Dutcher, who put forward the point that in this era, from the point of view of the colonial governments, in many ways, one of the best ways to exercise power was to refrain from exercising power, which is a negative sort of way of proceeding. In other words, to allow the destructive processes of encroachment and the environmental destruction that came from colonial settlement. And so it seems to me that that's actually very compatible with your argument in the sense that, you know, in some respects, laxity of Indian Affairs officials would fit very nicely with that kind of concept of colonial power. So I just wondered what, you know, if you might have comments on that.
Yeah, you definitely see that kind of philosophy being expressed. Kind of this idea of like, we don't want to interfere. We don't want to be too heavy-handed. You want to have, especially in an economic sense, you really want the market to really settle itself out. It will resolve all of the problems. Any of the surpluses will be taken care of. And it might be hard in the short term, but ultimately it's for the best. And in a lot of ways, the Mi'kmaq aren't seen as people that can contribute to the economy. They're seen as people that are inhibiting settlement, inhibiting an agricultural economy from developing and taking hold in Nova Scotia. So that's certainly the case from what I saw in the way in which neglect was kind of spoken about. It's almost like a benevolent neglect. It's not spoken of in a malicious way. It's just spoken of in a way that's like, oh, this is what is necessary and what's natural. This is bound to happen. It's natural for these kind of white settler desirable populations to take hold and dominate over the non-desirables.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose also in the minds of colonial authorities, I mean, the idea of the poor settler, that if you hold back from restraining the poor settler, then there could even be kind of a pretension to a moral kind of ascendancy in that, which is odd, but I think is the case. Yeah, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Lois York is up next.
Thank you. Grace, the archivist in me is coming out. I'm interested in the continuity of the records. And I believe that it is not unbroken by any means. You've mentioned that there are periods when there is no commissioner. What is your experience so far with the permanence of memory or the impermanence? And how have you been able to fill gaps where perhaps there is no government record?
So yeah, the government record is very wealthy. There's just this like wealth of knowledge. Yes. And thankfully, because of the Truth and Reconciliation process, so much of it has been digitized in the last couple of years. So it's really accessible to anyone. Looking at the colonial period of Nova Scotia, it's definitely inconsistent. You know, if there's no commissioner, then there's really not a lot being written. But it also kind of falls a little bit on personalities. So even after the Confederation period, and you have a lot more structure being established and a higher expectation of reporting, one of the major criticisms that the federal government has of the part-time Indian agents in Nova Scotia is they don't report. So they can't tell if they're actually going and doing what they say they're going to do. If you go through those annual reports, especially like right after the Indian Act is implemented, sometimes like less than half of the 22 agents submit any kind of annual report. So it's just this big like question mark for like canon for Sydney. So in terms of having to manage that, a lot of, for the colonial period, the management came from looking at the Office of Crown Lands. So the Office of Crown Lands was, well, all of the reserves would have been considered Crown lands. So they tend to be the people that are actually dealing with the day-to-day life of a lot of Mi'kmaq people, you know, their day-to-day complaints of this farmer has fenced off a section of the reserve. Can you help us? Very slow process of reacting to that. And in terms of the federal Confederation period, thankfully there's a lot better access to resources, I suppose. So whether it be correspondences between the provincial branch and the federal branch, those are really interesting to go to. And the font is digitized at Library and Archives Canada. So you see kind of the provincial branch head of the DIA in Nova Scotia contacting the federal head and being like, we don't have any money, can you please send us money? And then kind of the slow response of the federal government in return. So definitely inconsistent formal reporting, but lots of correspondences taking place.
That's very interesting. Newspaper coverage, personal papers. I'm thinking Churnley and the river fisheries. There's some records there, whether there's an admixture of his activities as the commissioner.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderfully bracing presentation, Grace. Lots to think about.
Thank you. And I will briefly say that when Joseph Howe is Commissioner of Indian Affairs, like that's the treasure trove, because he's just such a writer in general. He has a lot of like personal accounts of what it was like to be commissioner. And his reports are like, people just show up at my door and they ask me for coats and money, because that's what they've been led to believe is how the department works and operates. So that was a really interesting kind of person to look at.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lois. While we're on Indian agents, I have a question which might be brief to answer while someone else is putting their head together for a question or comment. And that is Gessner's policy, as you summarized it so succinctly, sounded to me more Catholic than Protestant in terms of various places in South America, and in Quebec, where Indigenous policy had a kind of more protective element to it. I don't recall that Gessner was Catholic, but I thought I'd ask and just generally say if you know anything about the sectarian background of this population of Indian agents.
Yeah, Gessner, I do not believe is Catholic. I believe he's Methodist. That is just off the top of my head. Also kind of a very like mission-based theology practice. But his story is just so interesting and fascinating, because the reason he's deemed qualified for the position in the first place is because he was I believe a geologist in New Brunswick. And so he was going around for the colony of New Brunswick to try and slice out, where there might be mines, where there might be some sort of like tangible resource that the government could extract. And the guides that they required were Maliseet and Mi'kmaq people. And so he actually had an understanding of the Mi'kmaq language. He could speak Mi'kmaq to some extent. So he approached it almost like an academic in some ways. He had a very different background than the rest of the Indian agents during that period of time.
Right. And any sense of whether there was a preponderance of Catholic or Protestant? I mean, in Quebec, you often see clergy. You often see it's Reverend so-and-so who is the Indian agent. No sign of that one way or another. Might not have been within the scope of your research.
Yeah, actually, one of the earliest things I did was actually looking at Indian agents, what their occupations were, because at the time I was doing a different project. But he, throughout the late 1800s, clergy is like the second most common occupation that a part-time Indian agent would have as like their day job. So a lot of priests come through, and a lot of them are in kind of like Cape Breton and northern mainland. So in and around kind of the Archdiocese of Antigonish, they have a huge influence over that area. And then as you go further south, and then I guess eastward towards Halifax, you see less of that.
Great, thanks. Other questions or comments? I see from Hope Beanlands, a hand raised. Floor is yours, Hope.
Okay, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentation. It was fascinating, and I'm wondering, given that my understanding that the Mi'kmaq tend to be a nation that do not document, they have oral traditions as opposed to written documentation. Was there any evidence that they had any written documentation? And if so, what was it like and how did you find it? And that's one question. Another question is, I understand, well, from what little I know, that the treaties with the Mi'kmaq were very different from treaties from certainly the West and from Southern Ontario. And I'm wondering how that influenced, or does that show up in your research?
So to answer the first part, the Mi'kmaq definitely have an oral history and oral tradition. I do believe there is a writing system that was kind of produced, I believe, in tandem with Jesuit missionaries, but
Yes.
that's a little before my area of research. In terms of how their kind of written accounts show up, I find that they tend to appear a lot later in the record. So you have a lot of like firsthand accounts of experiences of centralization and rationalization, what it was like to live on reserves, that were recorded later on by either Mi'kmaq people or their someone who is writing for them. In terms of how they show up, I find most often it's through court documents. So it's not actually Mi'kmaq people writing, it's someone writing for them. And there's a really interesting series of letters that were sent from a Mi'kmaq chief to Queen Victoria in the 1840s, which he did not personally write, but had someone write for him. And they are written in kind of, they're written verbatim, so how the Mi'kmaq person would speak it. And those are really fascinating and really interesting to look at. What was the second question? Sorry.
The second question is, it's my understanding that the treaties between, were quite different.
Yes. Yeah, so I don't want to say that I am an expert on treaty law. I'm certainly not. But based on my understanding of it, it's correct that the peace and friendship treaties that are written in Nova Scotia are a lot earlier than the numbered treaties that you see in Ontario and Western Canada. In terms of how they play out in Nova Scotia, it is definitely a similar experience of these treaties were written that protected a lot of, mostly protected Mi'kmaq rights to access to certain things. So access to coastline and to fisheries, access to traditional lands that they would migrate in between. Migration is a huge issue in the eyes of the Nova Scotian government, because they basically just want the Mi'kmaq to settle in one spot, but it's very traditional for them to move between seasonal hunting grounds. So it's definitely a similar experience of having certain things promised and then those things being neglected and not pursued until the kind of cases of Chief Syllaboy, for instance, in the 1920s, when for the first time you see people trying to defend those treaty rights in courts, in federal courts.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Hope. And I see Len Canfield is muted and Leo Doyle Len Canfield, are you wishing to ask a question?
Yeah, it's, can you hear me at this stage?
We can, thank you.
Good. It's a follow-up to the question that was there. And first of all, an excellent presentation this evening. Always impressed with somebody that can put across a great amount of information in a very informative and factual manner. Question I have, it relates to the 1760 and 61 peace and friendship treaties. of which there were 10 with the different Mi'kmaq groups. And how were these treaties, how did they influence, how did they frame as to the relationship that the colonial administrations had following on through the periods that you have described this evening? So that's my question.
From the documents that I look at, which are for the most part the colonial government's reports, so how the colonial government is interpreting the circumstances that are taking place, they like never mention those treaties. In a lot of ways, I think those treaties represent the fragility of British power when they were written. British power was far from consolidated in 1760 and 1761. You always have that threat from other imperial powers, and also the Mi'kmaq, who were far more established in the province than the British were during that period of time. So from my research, at the very least, they have very little influence on the types of policies that are pursued by the British government in subsequent decades. And in terms of, for the Mi'kmaq, they certainly remember. They certainly have a very prominent memory of these treaties that will often be invoked when they are asking for whether it be land and access to resources, or whether it be something far more insignificant like coats and money and food, something far more basic need. They will invoke those treaties. However, the success of those invocations tends to fall on the circumstances that the British government is in. For instance, if they're fighting the Americans at that period of time, they'll be far more likely to say, "Oh yes, the treaties. We shall, uphold the gift-giving ceremony that we have agreed to." So, yeah.
Thank you, Lynn, and thanks, Grace. Next in queue is Leo Doyle. Floor is yours, Leo.
Hi, Grace. That was wonderful in terms of your ability to really succinctly go over a large body of material. I actually work at Crown Indigenous Relations in Ottawa.
Oh, okay.
But you know far more than I do about this particular population in this particular period. But one of the things that fascinated me, I did an assignment at one point in the Indian Registry. And I was very surprised to see Nova Scotians now writing in and kind of rediscovering their Indigenous ancestry, many of whom, kind of opted out many generations ago. But I'm curious, what did you see in terms of, because you commented on it previously, just that migration of people, because we're talking, the Mi'kmaq population in Nova Scotia was only a few thousand, and scattered in various groups. You mentioned Shubenacadie, and in Cape Breton, you had Eskasoni, you had the King's Road. So what did you see in terms of that research of the challenge that the agents had in terms of tracking that population at the same time as Wiccan describes in Syllaboy and the King, that there is a high degree of intermarriage going on and assimilation and outmigration? I'm just interested in terms of what you saw that, because you also had a population that was moving back and forth between places like Cape Breton and south coast of Newfoundland and that. Did you see those stories? And I'm just curious what you saw.
So there is certainly a lot of loss of Indian status, and so the sense that you're legally not Indigenous anymore, whether it be through acts that, if a woman marries a non-Indigenous person, they're revoking their status. And then those policies change a lot over time. So sometimes the children of that marriage would have status, sometimes they wouldn't. You can't have it through your marital line, but other times you can. It's a very complicated history to have a very cultural identity that's being so politicized about who and who cannot be Indian, quote unquote. In terms of migration, that it definitely takes place a lot. You see a huge migration of Indigenous people, Mi'kmaq people, to centers like Halifax and to Sydney, where they're trying to pick up some sort of kind of like hobbycraft job to sell baskets, to work as laborers. There is a constant movement of people, and that plays a huge role in the eligibility of the Mi'kmaq. For a long time, they don't even, when Nova Scotia joins Confederation, they can't tell the federal government how many Mi'kmaq there are. They have to just kind of give a general estimate because they have no census of Mi'kmaq people in Nova Scotia. And then the most dramatic migration takes place during kind of the relocations. So the removal of Mi'kmaq people from urban centers to more peripheral communities. So the Kings Road Reserve becomes member 2, up and away from the water. And then during centralization, attempt to push people to those reserves, which was successful in a lot of ways. Eskazoni, I believe, is still the largest Mi'kmaq reserve in Nova Scotia, and it wasn't before this. The thing that was most fascinating about that was the Mi'kmaq reaction to policies like centralization, because there's actually quite a division. You see a lot of people who are opposed to it, but you also see a lot of Mi'kmaq leaders who, at least initially, are in favor of it. They think that the best way for them to consolidate their power and their wealth is to centralize and is to have a designated community that is large and distinct and visible in the eyes of the Canadian government. So it's a really fascinating series of events that moves people around in a relatively small region of Canada. So much movement taking place.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leo, and thank you, Grace. Is there another question / comment for Grace tonight? Looking for unmuted people or people with their hands raised. We are getting fairly close to the usual end of the usual time we end for the evening. I have a question about tax, but I'll save that for later. Because that's my personal obsession. And I don't want to cause any fatal rolling of the eyes amongst the audience. All right, so that's it, last call. Well, clearly echoing everyone's comments, that was a fine presentation. I think that something that no one commented on, but that in terms of the national literature is really important, that distinction you make between a neglect that empowers resistance and a neglect that's just harmful and in its own way oppressive. You know, you stand to actually get a nice place in discussion groups on that question with this intervention. And so that, among other things, is a really great thing. So I will announce the next talk and then turn it over to Lois for the final thanks and acknowledgement. And the next talk will be on April 21st. It'll be Laurie Glenn Norris. And she will be speaking on some letters at the Seaman household in McNutt. It's called Everyone is at Home at a Methodist Minister's House. The letters of Mary Seaman Pike and Jenny Seaman Wooten, 1874 to 1890. So I hope to see you there, people, next month, and over to Lois to say goodbye.
Thank you, Shirley. An excellent presentation. You've given us an awful lot to think about, Grace. We wish you much good fortune as you move into the PhD studies. We hope you will come back with another lecture for us sometime down the road. That said, I thank everyone who came this evening. We'll look forward to seeing you again next month, and we will hope before too much longer to be able to think about coming together in person. Not quite yet, but soon. Good night, everybody. Thank you.